Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we embark on a gentle journey through time, exploring one of humanity's most fundamental needs, the need to stay warm. Before thermostats and radiators, before the flick of a switch could flood a room with heat, our ancestors developed countless ingenious methods to ward off the cold. This is not a story of dramatic invention or revolutionary change, but rather a slow, steady accumulation of small comforts and gradual improvements spanning thousands of years. As you settle in, perhaps with your own blanket nearby, consider how different your experience of warmth is from those who came before. The chill of winter was once not merely an inconvenience, but a genuine threat. A season to be endured with patience and preparation. Yet people found ways not just to survive, but to create pockets of comfort, to gather together, to make the cold months bearable, and even at times cozy. Think about your own relationship with warmth for a moment. Perhaps you've adjusted a thermostat today, or felt the warm air beginning to flow from a vent. Perhaps you've wrapped yourself in a blanket, or held a warm cup of coffee or tea. These small comforts, so readily available to us now, would have seemed miraculous to people living just a few centuries ago. The human body maintains a temperature of approximately 8.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or 37 degrees Celsius. When the air around us drops below this temperature, we must find ways to conserve our heat or generate more of it. This simple biological reality has shaped human civilization in profound ways. It has influenced where people chose to live, how they built their homes, what they wore, how they organized their daily routines, and how they came together as families and communities. In cold climates, the quest for warmth has been central to survival itself. In more temperate regions, it has been about comfort, about creating spaces where life could be lived pleasantly, even when the weather outside was harsh. Either way, warmth has been something people have had to actively create and maintain, something that required knowledge, effort, and resources. Let us begin our journey in the ancient world, where the problem of warmth first found systematic solutions that went beyond the simple campfire. We will travel through time slowly, examining not just the technologies people developed, but the experiences those technologies created, the labor they required, and the social structures that formed around them. In the hills of ancient Rome, as autumn gave way to winter, wealthy citizens enjoyed a luxury that would not be widespread again for nearly 2,000 years. Heated floors. The Roman hippocaust system was in many ways the most sophisticated heating technology the world would see until the modern era. To understand just how remarkable this was, we need to descend beneath the beautiful marble floors of a Roman villa and explore what lies hidden below. The word hypocaust comes from the Greek hypokoston, which means heat from below. And that is precisely, literally what it was. Imagine, if you will, a large villa on the outskirts of Rome, perhaps during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century. The villa belongs to a wealthy merchant or government official. From the outside, it appears as a single-story structure with a colonnade surrounding a central courtyard. But beneath the visible house lies another structure entirely, a hidden chamber that makes the comfort above possible. This underground space, which we might call a furnace room, though that term doesn't quite capture it, is perhaps 2 to 3 feet in height. It extends beneath most of the house, a vast cavern that no one ever sees, but everyone benefits from. The ceiling of this space is the floor of the house above. Supporting this ceiling are hundreds of small pillars, called pile, made of brick or stone. These pillars are arranged in neat rows, spaced perhaps 18 inches to 2 feet apart, creating what looks like a miniature forest of columns. Each pillar is about 2 feet tall, square in cross-section, carefully mortared together from flat tiles called besales. The precision of their placement is important. Too far apart and the floor above might sag or crack. Too close together and the hot air cannot circulate efficiently. Walking through this space, if you could, if you were one of the slaves who occasionally had to venture in for repairs, you would have to crouch or crawl. The air would be intensely hot and dry during the heating season. The brick pillars would radiate heat, and touching them would be painful. The space would smell of smoke and hot stone, and the darkness would be nearly complete, except for the orange glow coming from the prefurnium, the furnace opening. At one end of this underground labyrinth, there is an opening, the prefurnium. This is where a fire burns constantly during the cold months, tended by slaves whose entire purpose is to maintain this hidden flame. The prefurnium is accessed from outside the house, often from a service area or courtyard where the slaves work. This separation is important. It means that the mess and smoke of the fire never intrudes into the living spaces above. The fire itself is built in a chamber made of heat-resistant fire brick. It must be substantial, for this single fire will heat an entire house. Large logs of oak or other hardwood are burned, chosen for their ability to produce sustained, even heat rather than quick, intense flames. The logs are arranged carefully, with space for air to flow between them, ensuring efficient combustion. Tending this fire is skilled work, despite its low status. The furnace slave must judge the weather, the wind, the dampness of the wood, the needs of the household. On the coldest days, the fire burns hot and fast, consuming wood at a prodigious rate. On milder days, it can be allowed to burn more gently. At night, it might be partially damped down, though never completely extinguished. Starting a fire from scratch was too difficult and time-consuming to allow that. The slave assigned to the furnace begins work before dawn. The first task is to clear the previous day's ashes. These are still warm, sometimes hot enough to burn if handled carelessly. They must be raked out and carried away, often to be used in lye making for soap or in various other household purposes. Nothing was wasted in the Roman economy. Fresh wood must then be brought. A large villa might burn through several cartloads of wood in a single cold day. This wood has been cut and stored months earlier, left to dry so it will burn efficiently. Wet or green wood produces more smoke and less heat, and would be unacceptable. The slave must select appropriate pieces. Not so large they're difficult to manage. Not so small they burn too quickly. The art lies in maintaining a consistent fire. Too little wood and the heat dwindles, the rooms above grow cold, and the master or mistress will complain. Too much wood and the fire roars too hot. The floor above might become uncomfortably warm, or worse, the intense heat might crack the tiles or stones. There were incidents, recorded in Roman writings, of hypocaust fires that grew too intense and damaged floors, or even of fires that spread from the hypocaust to the structure above. Once the fire is burning properly, the hot air and smoke begin their journey. Unlike a simple fire that sends heat straight up, The hypocaust is designed to extract as much warmth as possible before allowing the smoke to escape. The hot gases from the fire spread out horizontally, flowing between those pillars we described earlier. They move laterally, seeking paths through this maze-like space. The journey is not straight. The gases swirl and eddy, bouncing off pillars, their heat constantly radiating into the brick and stone around them. These pillars and the floor they support act as what we would now call thermal mass. They absorb the heat from the air around them, warming up gradually but thoroughly. Brick and stone are excellent at this. They heat slowly but hold that heat for a long time. Even after the fire dies down, they continue radiating warmth for hours. The floor above is not a simple structure. It consists of multiple layers, each serving a purpose. Resting directly on top of the pili are large square tiles called bipedales, each about 2 Roman feet on a side. These cover the gaps between pillars, creating the ceiling of the hypocaust chamber and the foundation of the floor above. On top of the bipedales comes a layer of concrete. Roman concrete, that remarkable material made from volcanic ash, lime, and aggregate. This layer is several inches thick, providing both structural strength and additional thermal mass. It also helps to even out any variations in temperature, ensuring that the heat reaching the surface is consistent. Finally, there is the floor surface itself. In a wealthy home, this might be marble. Cool white Carrara marble from Tuscany, or colorful varieties imported from Greece or North Africa. The marble is polished smooth, beautiful to look at and pleasant to touch. Or the floor might be mosaic, countless small colored tiles arranged in intricate patterns. Geometric designs, scenes from mythology, depictions of seasons or daily life. This careful layering achieves something subtle but important. It prevents the floor from becoming too hot. A floor that is too hot to walk on would be useless, even dangerous. Instead, through these layers, the heat is moderated. The surface of the floor becomes pleasantly warm. Warm enough to radiate heat into the room. Warm enough that you can feel it underfoot, but not so hot as to be uncomfortable. On a cold Roman winter evening, imagine walking across such a floor. You've come in from outside, where your breath forms the clouds in the air. You remove your outdoor sandals or shoes. The marble floor feels warm under your bare feet. Not hot, not uncomfortably so, but distinctly warm. It's a gentle, enveloping warmth that seems to rise up through your body. You can stand on this floor for hours without discomfort, without your feet growing cold, as they would on stone or tile, in an unheated space. But the hypocaust system doesn't stop with the floor. In many Roman buildings, especially bathhouses, the heating extends up the walls. This is accomplished through hollow bricks called tubuli. Essentially rectangular tubes made of fired clay. These tubuli are stacked vertically within the walls, creating channels from the hypocaust space below to vents near the roof. The hot air from the hypocaust, after circulating under the floor and giving up much of its heat there, still has warmth to give. It rises naturally. Hot air always rises and finds its way into these vertical channels. As the hot air ascends through the tubuli, it heats the walls from within. The warmth radiates from the wall surface into the room. A person standing near such a wall can feel the heat emanating from it. If you place your hand on the wall, it feels warm to the touch. Sometimes quite hot, depending on how close the tubuli are to the surface. and how intensely the hypocaust is burning. This vertical circulation serves another crucial purpose. It draws the fire. The rising hot air in the tubuli creates what we now call a draft, pulling more hot air from the hypocaust, which in turn pulls more air into the fire itself. This natural convection makes the fire burn more efficiently, ensuring complete combustion and creating a self-regulating system. At the top of the walls, the tubuli open to the outside through vents. This is where the smoke finally escapes, having given up virtually all its heat to the building. These vents are often decorative, disguised as part of the architectural ornamentation, so the house appears beautiful while functioning efficiently. The result of all this engineering is a room that is warm from multiple directions simultaneously. The floor radiates heat upward. The walls radiate heat inward. The air itself is warmed both by contact with these surfaces and by the rising warm air. It's an enveloping warmth, a three-dimensional comfort that few heating systems before or since have matched. While wealthy homes might have hypocausts, the place where this technology really shone was in the public bathhouses. The thermae. These were not merely places to wash, but central institutions of Roman social life. Men gathered there to exercise, to discuss business and politics, to socialize with friends, to see and be seen. Women, in their own hours or in separate facilities, did likewise. The progression through a Roman bath was a carefully choreographed journey through different temperatures, and the hypocaust system made this possible. You would enter through the apoditorium, the changing room. Here, the temperature was comfortable, warm enough to undress without discomfort. Attendants would take your clothes and store them, giving you a token to reclaim them later. You might begin with exercise in the palestra, an open courtyard for wrestling, ball games, and other athletics. Working up a sweat prepared your body for the baths to come. Then you'd enter the tepidarium, the warm room. The name comes from the Latin tepidus, meaning lukewarm. Here, the hypocaust burned moderately. The room was warm, perhaps slightly warmer than the changing room, but not intensely so. This was a place of transition, allowing your body to adjust gradually. The floor of the tepidarium was warm underfoot. The walls were warm to the touch. You might sit on a stone bench, also warmed from within, and feel your muscles beginning to relax. Some bathers would linger here, enjoying conversation with friends, the warmth soaking into their bodies without overwhelming them. Next came the caldarium, the hot room. Here, the hypocaust burned most intensely. Multiple furnaces might feed the hypocaust under the caldarium, and the heat was considerable. The air was thick and steamy, heavy with moisture from the hot pools that were part of the room. Sweat would bead on your skin within moments of entering. The floor of the caldarium could be quite hot, sometimes too hot to stand on comfortably. Romans wore special wooden sandals called scolponae in the caldarium to protect their feet. These sandals had thick wooden soles that insulated the foot from the heat of the floor. The sound of these wooden sandals clacking on the stone floors would have been a characteristic sound of the baths. In the caldarium, bathers would immerse themselves in hot pools, sit in the steamy air, and sweat profusely. This was considered deeply healthful. Sweating was thought to purge the body of illness and impurities. An attendant might scrape your skin with a strigil, a curved metal implement, removing oil, sweat, and dead skin. Wealthier patrons might bring their own slaves to perform this service, while others would pay bathhouse attendants. The experience in the caldarium was intense. The heat penetrated deeply, muscles loosened, circulation increased. You might feel lightheaded from the heat and steam. Some bathers stayed only briefly, others lingered as long as they could bear it. There was a certain machismo in enduring the heat, particularly among men who would boast of how long they could remain in the hottest rooms. From the caldarium, many Romans would then proceed to the frigidarium, the cold room. This was unheated and contained pools of cold water, sometimes actually chilled with ice brought down from the mountains and stored underground. The contrast could not be more extreme. Plunging into cold water after the intense heat of the caldarium was bracing, to say the least. Your body, which moments ago was dripping with sweat, suddenly experiences intense cold. Your skin prickles, your breath catches, your heart rate spikes. The Romans believed this was extremely healthful. The hot opening the pores and cleaning the body, the cold closing them again and invigorating the system. Modern science suggests they weren't entirely wrong. The alternating hot and cold does improve circulation, and the practice may have immune system benefits. But whether healthful or not, it was certainly a memorable experience, and one that became an integral part of Roman culture. After the frigidarium, you might return to the tepidarium to warm up gradually, or you might proceed to rooms for massage, for the application of oils and perfumes, or simply to sit and talk with friends. The entire experience might take hours. The bathhouse was a place to spend an afternoon or evening, a social institution as much as a hygienic one. And all of this, every bit of this elaborate ritual, depended on the hypercourse systems burning beneath the floors, tended by slaves who were largely invisible to the bathers enjoying the facilities above. We must pause here and acknowledge those who made this comfort possible. While citizens and wealthy residents enjoyed heated homes and luxurious bathhouses, slaves performed the hot, difficult, and dangerous work that produced this warmth. The life of a furnace slave was hard. They worked in conditions that were often brutal. The Prefurnium area, where the fire was tended, was hot and smoky. In summer, when the hypocausts were not in use, it might not be so bad, but in winter, when the fires burned constantly, the heat was extreme. The slave might be working just feet from a roaring fire, in an area where the temperature could reach well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was full of smoke and ash. Eyes would water and burn. Breathing was difficult. The work was physically demanding. Wood had to be hauled, fires tended, ashes removed. A slave might shovel ashes and haul wood for hours at a stretch. The ashes were heavy, the wood cumbersome. It was easy to burn yourself on hot metal tools or on the ashes themselves. When repairs were needed in the hypercourse chamber itself, the conditions were even worse. The fire would be allowed to die down and cool, but the space would still be uncomfortably warm. Someone, always a slave, would have to crawl into this low space, carrying tools and materials to repair a cracked pillar or replace a damaged tile. The work was dark, confined, and hot even when the fire was out. Slaves doing this work might be in the hypercourse chamber for hours, crouched or lying flat, working by the light of oil lamps, breathing air thick with residual smoke and dust. It was dangerous work too. If a pillar was badly damaged, there was risk of collapse. And yet, To the wealthy Romans who walked on heated floors above, this labor was invisible. They experienced only the warmth, the comfort. They might give no more thought to how it was produced than we give to how the heat appears when we adjust a thermostat. The slaves were part of the infrastructure, like the bricks and tiles themselves. This invisibility of labor, this separation between those who enjoy comfort and those who produce it, is something we'll see again and again as we move through history. It's a theme worth noting, even in this gentle exploration of warmth. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, much of this technology was lost. The knowledge of how to build and maintain hypocausts faded from memory. The buildings themselves fell into disrepair. The hypocaust chambers filled with rubble and earth, the furnaces cold and abandoned. Medieval Europeans, coming upon the ruins of Roman bathhouses, could see that these buildings had once been warm. The soot stains on walls, the arrangement of rooms, the presence of pools, all suggested bathing and comfort. But they couldn't quite understand the mechanism. The hypocaust chambers, now buried or collapsed, were not obvious. The system that had once seemed permanent, that had heated Roman buildings for centuries, vanished from Western Europe. The knowledge did persist in the Eastern Roman Empire, in Byzantium, in Constantinople. There, hypocausts continued to be built and maintained for centuries more. But in the West, in what became medieval France, Germany, England, Italy, people would have to rediscover warmth in simpler, more primitive ways. It would be nearly 1,500 years before European heating technology would again approach the sophistication and comfort of the Roman hypocaust. When central heating returned in the 18th and 19th centuries, it would operate on different principles, using hot water or steam in pipes rather than circulating hot air. But the Roman hypocaust, with its heated floors and walls, its enveloping warmth, would remain unsurpassed in some ways, even into the modern era. When the Roman Empire crumbled, so too did much of its infrastructure and technological sophistication. The intricate hypocaust systems were abandoned, their secrets lost. Medieval Europe had to begin again with the most basic form of warmth, the open fire. But even this simple technology took forms that were shaped by social structure, architecture, and daily life in ways that are worth examining slowly and carefully. The centerpiece of heating in a medieval household of any size was the Great Hall. This was not merely a room, but the heart of the household, the space where life was lived publicly. In a manor house or castle, the Great Hall might be enormous, perhaps 60 feet long, 40 feet wide, with a ceiling that soared 25 or 30 feet above the floor. In a more modest dwelling, it might be smaller, but it was still the largest and most important room. At the center of this hall, or sometimes slightly off to one side, burned a fire. Not a small, cozy fire like we might imagine in a fireplace today, but a substantial blaze, built of large logs that might be 3 or 4 feet long and as thick as a man's torso. These logs rested directly on the floor, often on a slightly raised platform of stone or packed earth, or sometimes on heavy iron andirons that lifted them slightly to allow air to flow beneath. This fire was open on all sides. There was no hearth in the modern sense, no enclosure, no chimney directly above it. The fire burned openly in the middle of the room, and the smoke rose naturally to the high ceiling. There, in the rafters and the roof structure above, the smoke would accumulate, a thick layer of it, before slowly finding its way out through openings in the roof. These openings might be a simple hole, a space left deliberately in the roof where the smoke could escape. Or they might be more sophisticated, louvered openings that could be adjusted to control the draft. Or a structure called a louver on the roof peak that allowed smoke out while keeping rain from coming directly in. Even so, in rain or snow, some moisture inevitably entered through these openings, and the hall was never entirely dry. The result of this arrangement was that the great hall was perpetually smoky. Not chokingly so. The high ceiling kept the worst of it well above head level. But there was always a haze in the air, a thickness to the atmosphere. Your eyes might water slightly. Everything in the hall absorbed smoke. The wooden beams overhead blackened with soot. The tapestries on the walls took on a smoky smell. The clothes people wore became impregnated with that characteristic scent. But this smoke was not entirely a disadvantage. It had preservative qualities. The wooden beams of the ceiling, exposed to smoke day after day, year after year, became saturated with the smoke's compounds. This made them resistant to insects and to rot. A smoked beam would last far longer than an unsmoked one. Similarly, hams and other meats hung in the rafters to cure, the smoke preserving them. In a time before refrigeration, this was valuable. The arrangement of the fire also dictated the social geography of the hall. Proximity to the fire was a mark of status. The lord and lady of the manor and their most important guests would sit closest to the fire, often on a raised platform or dais at one end of the hall. Here, chairs or benches would be arranged facing the fire, positioned to receive its warmth directly. These seats might have high backs and sides, not just for comfort, but to block drafts and to reflect heat toward the occupant. Some chairs were designed almost like small enclosed boxes, with wooden panels on 3 sides and a high back, creating a personal pocket of warmth even in a drafty hall. As you moved further from the fire, the temperature dropped considerably. Those of lesser status, household servants, retainers, soldiers in a military household, would sit or stand further away, receiving less of the fire's warmth. The warmth you experienced in a medieval hall was directly proportional to your social importance. The fire served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided light, the primary source of illumination once the sun set. Candles and oil lamps might supplement it, particularly for close work like reading or needlework. But the fire was the main light source. Its flickering, dancing light created a constantly shifting illumination. Shadows moved on the walls. Faces appeared and disappeared from the gloom. Tapestries and wall paintings seemed to come alive in the moving light. The fire was also where food was prepared. Cooking pots hung from chains directly over the flames, suspended from a tripod or from an iron bar called a trammel that could be raised or lowered to control the heat. Meat roasted on spits. Long iron rods run through the meat, supported at either end, turned slowly over the flames to ensure even cooking. Turning these spits was tedious work, assigned to the lowest servants, often children. They would sit by the fire for hours, slowly and steadily, turning the spit so the meat cooked evenly. Some wealthy households had mechanical spit jacks, ingenious devices powered by weights or by the rising hot air from the fire itself, which turned the spit automatically. But these were rare and expensive. Most spits were turned by human labor, hour after patient hour. At night, the great hall transformed. During the day, it might be relatively empty, People dispersed to their various tasks. But as darkness fell, the household gathered, the fire would be built up, fresh logs added, the flames leaping higher. This was when the hall felt most alive, most central to household life. Dinner would be served, the table set up. In many medieval halls, tables were not permanent furniture, but boards laid across trestles, which could be taken down and stored when not in use. The household would eat together, arranged by status, the lord and lady presiding, honored guests seated near them, others further away. After dinner, there might be entertainment. A traveling minstrel might sing or recite poetry. Members of the household might tell stories or play simple games. Or there might simply be conversation, the exchange of news and gossip, discussion of the day's events or plans for tomorrow. All of this took place in the circle of firelight, beyond which the hall faded into darkness. As the evening wore on, people would begin to settle for sleep. In all but the grandest households, most people slept in the great hall. Pallets would be unrolled, simple mattresses stuffed with straw, or for those of higher status, with feathers. Blankets would be distributed. People would bed down on the floor, as close to the fire as they dared. The fire would be banked for the night. A careful process. Too many fresh logs, and it might burn too hot, wasting fuel and creating a risk of sparks escaping. Too little attention, and it might go out entirely, which was to be avoided. The technique was to rake hot coals into a concentrated pile, then cover them partially with ashes. This smothered the flames, but allowed the coals to continue burning slowly, producing heat without flame. A properly banked fire would last through the night, and in the morning, it could be revived by adding kindling and blowing on the coals to bring them back to flame. Those sleeping nearest the fire enjoyed the most warmth, but they also took the most risk. A stray spark, a shift of wind, and a pallet might catch fire. The straw-stuffed mattresses were particularly flammable. Accidents happen more often than we might like to think. People might wake to find their bedding smoldering, or worse, wake to flames already spreading. The smoke, though less dense at floor level than up in the rafters, was still present. Throughout the night, the air would be hazy with it. People would cough in their sleep, their throats irritated. But this was so normal, so much a part of life, that it was barely remarked upon. You slept in smoke. You woke in smoke. You lived your life in an atmosphere we would find nearly unbearable. Those of higher status did not sleep in the common hall. The lord and lady, and perhaps their older children or important guests, had private chambers. These were smaller rooms, often on an upper floor or in a separate wing of the building. Privacy and status went hand in hand. The more important you were, the more likely you had your own space. But these private chambers presented a problem. How to heat them? Some chambers, particularly in later medieval buildings, might have their own small fireplace built into a wall. But this was a luxury. And even then, a small fireplace in a small room provided limited heat. The chimney technology necessary for wall fireplaces was not widespread in Europe until the 12th and 13th centuries. And even then, it spread slowly. For chambers without fireplaces, warmth had to be brought to the room. This is where braziers became important. A brazier was a portable container for holding hot coals. The most common type was made of metal, copper, bronze, iron. shaped like a bowl or a shallow pan, raised on legs or a pedestal. In the evening, a servant would use a shovel or tongs to transfer hot coals from the main fire in the great hall to the brazier. This brazier would then be carried carefully to the chamber, providing a source of heat. The coals glowed red-orange in the darkness, radiating warmth in a circle around them. A brazier might be placed in the center of a small room, or near a chair where someone might sit. The warmth from a brazier was limited in range. You had to be fairly close to it to feel much benefit. But for a small room, it could make a significant difference. The coals would burn for several hours before dying out. Some braziers were designed with perforated sides or decorative cutouts, allowing the heat to radiate more effectively while also providing a pleasant visual effect. The glow of the coals visible through the perforations. But braziers came with serious risks, and medieval people were aware of these even if they didn't fully understand the mechanisms involved. The primary danger was not fire, though that was certainly a concern if the brazier tipped over, but suffocation. Burning coals consume oxygen from the air and produce carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is invisible, odorless, and deadly. In a small chamber with poor ventilation, particularly overnight when someone was sleeping, a brazier could be lethal. The victim would simply fail to wake up, their sleep deepening into unconsciousness and then death, all without any sign of struggle or distress. So, medieval people called this charcoal death, and they knew it was a real danger. They didn't understand the mechanism. The concept of oxygen and carbon monoxide wouldn't be discovered for many centuries. But they knew empirically that sleeping with a brazier in a closed room could kill you. The solution was ventilation, keeping a window open or ensuring there were gaps around doors. But this, of course, defeated the purpose to some extent. The heat from the brazier would escape through the same openings that were necessary for safety. It was a constant trade-off, a balance between warmth and safety that people navigated imperfectly. Some people took the risk, closing their chambers tightly on the coldest nights, hoping the brazier wouldn't produce too much carbon monoxide, that the room wasn't quite sealed enough to be lethal. Others were more cautious, using braziers only while awake and alert, removing them before sleeping. Still others avoided braziers entirely, relying instead on other methods of warmth. One safer method for warmth in bed was the bed warmer or warming pan. This was a specialized tool designed specifically for warming beds. A typical warming pan consisted of a long wooden handle, 4 or 5 feet in length, attached to a flat metal pan with a hinged lid. The pan might be brass, copper, or iron, depending on the wealth of the household. To use a warming pan, you would place hot coals from the fire inside the pan, close the lid, and then move the pan back and forth between the sheets of the bed. The metal would heat up from the coals inside, and this heat would transfer to the fabric of the sheets and to the mattress itself. You had to keep the pan moving. If you left it in one spot too long, you might scorch the sheets or even burn a hole through them. The technique required a certain skill. Too few coals and the pan wouldn't heat effectively. Too many and it might become so hot it would damage the bed linens. The coals needed to be red hot, but not actively flaming. The motion needed to be steady and systematic, warming all areas of the bed evenly, paying particular attention to the foot of the bed where feet would be, but not neglecting the upper portion. Done properly, the result was a bed that was already warm when you got into it. A small luxury on a cold night. The sheets felt pleasant against your skin rather than shockingly cold. The mattress held heat for a while too, though it would gradually cool over the course of the night. Still, getting into an already warm bed made those first moments much more comfortable and helped you fall asleep more easily. An even simpler method was the heated stone. This required no special equipment at all. You would simply take a smooth stone, 钟, ideally one from a river worn smooth by water, and place it near the fire or even directly in the fire's edge, where it would gradually heat up over the course of the evening. Once thoroughly heated, and a good-sized stone could hold an enormous amount of heat, the stone would be wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed, usually at the foot where it would warm the feet. The cloth wrapping was essential. An unwrapped, hot stone could cause burns if it came in direct contact with skin. Wrapped in several layers of cloth, though, it provided gentle, sustained warmth. A large stone, properly heated and wrapped, could stay noticeably warm for hours, sometimes all night. Even after several hours, when you shifted in your sleep and your foot encountered the stone again, it would still be warm. It was a simple, safe, and effective method that required nothing more than a stone, some cloth, and access to a fire. Beyond external sources of heat, medieval people relied heavily on clothing and bedding for warmth. The principle, though they might not have thought of it in these terms, was insulation through layers. Each layer of cloth trapped air, and still air is an excellent insulator. A wealthy medieval person dressing on a cold morning would don multiple layers first. A linen undershirt or chemise, worn next to the skin. Then a tunic, often of wool, perhaps reaching to mid-thigh or knee. Over this, a surcoat, another layer, perhaps of heavier wool. And over all of this, a cloak, ideally lined with fur. Fur was particularly valued for warmth. The pelts of squirrels, rabbits, foxes, and other animals were sewn together to create linings for cloaks and robes. The wealthy might have cloaks lined with expensive furs. Ermine, sable, marten. These were not just status symbols, but genuinely functional. Fur provided remarkable warmth for its weight, and the air trapped within and between the hairs provided excellent insulation. A fully dressed medieval noble might be wearing 4 or 5 layers on their torso, plus a heavy cloak. Their legs would be covered with wool hose or leggings, and their feet with leather shoes or boots, perhaps lined with cloth or fur. Their hands might be covered with gloves or mittens. In the coldest weather, they might wrap their head and neck with a hood or scarf. All of this clothing was heavy and cumbersome by modern standards. Moving around in so many layers was awkward. Doing physical work while dressed so heavily was difficult, which is one reason why laborers often wore fewer layers despite the cold. They simply couldn't work effectively while so heavily dressed. At night, the same principle of layering applied to bedding. A bed might have multiple blankets piled on top of each other. The wealthy might have blankets of fine wool, soft and warm. Those of more modest means made do with coarser fabrics, rougher against the skin, but still effective for warmth. The wealthiest had an additional advantage: curtained beds. These were beds surrounded by heavy fabric curtains hanging from a frame or canopy. When you got into such a bed, you could draw the curtains close, creating a small enclosed space. This space would warm up quickly from your body heat alone, and the curtains prevented that warmth from dissipating into the cold room. Inside a curtained bed, piled with blankets. You could be genuinely warm even if the chamber itself was freezing. It was like creating a small personal room within a room. The curtains also provided privacy and blocked light, making sleep easier. For those of lesser means, peasants, labourers, the vast majority of medieval society, warmth was far more precarious. A peasant cottage might be just a single room, shared with animals whose body heat provided additional warmth. The walls might be wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with a mixture of mud, clay and straw, which provided some insulation but not much. The fire in a peasant cottage would be small by necessity. Fuel was expensive in terms of labour, even if not in terms of money. Gathering firewood took time and effort, and forests were often controlled by nobles who restricted access. Taking wood without permission was poaching, a crime that could be severely punished, fines, imprisonment, or worse. So peasants burned what they could find legally: fallen branches, twigs, dried animal dung, peat cut from bogs, furs and gorse gathered from common lands. These fuels burned differently than good hardwood. Dung and peat produced a lot of smoke and a distinctive smell. Twigs and small branches burned quickly, requiring constant attention. But they kept the fire going, and that was what mattered. In the coldest months, a peasant family might huddle together, wearing all their clothes even to bed, sharing a single rough blanket, using straw packed around and beneath them for insulation. The animals, a cow, a pig, chickens, shared the space, and their body heat was not insignificant. A sioux is a large animal producing considerable warmth. Having one in your living space made a real difference on a freezing night. It was a hard existence. Many did not survive particularly harsh winters. The elderly, the very young, the already sick or malnourished. For them, extreme cold could be fatal. They would go to sleep and simply not wake up, their bodies unable to maintain sufficient warmth through the night. This was common enough that it was accepted as part of the natural order. A sad but expected reality of winter. Somewhere around the 12th century in Europe, a technology began to spread that would transform homes and daily life. The chimney. It seems so simple now, so obvious that we rarely stop to think about it. But before the chimney, homes were smoky, dark, and cold outside the immediate vicinity of the fire. The chimney changed all of this, and its impact on domestic life cannot be overstated. A chimney is essentially a vertical shaft that allows smoke to exit a building directly, drawing it up and away rather than letting it accumulate in the room. This means a fire can be built against a wall, enclosed on 3 sides, with the smoke captured by a hood and channeled upward through the shaft. The fire is contained, controlled, and the smoke goes where you want it to go rather than filling the entire space. The earliest chimneys were crude affairs. A simple hole in an exterior wall with a hood above the fire to catch smoke. The hood might be made of plaster, of brick, or even of wood, coated with clay to protect it from the heat. These early chimneys often didn't work very well. Without sufficient height, they didn't create much draft. Smoke might spill back into the room if the wind blew from the wrong direction. But gradually, through trial and error, builders learned what worked. They learned that chimneys needed to be tall. The taller the chimney, the better the draft. Rising hot air in the chimney creates an upward pull. drawing smoke from the fire and pulling fresh air into the fire from the room. The greater the height difference, the stronger this effect. They learned about materials too. Stone and brick were ideal. They could withstand heat. They were durable and they didn't catch fire. The interior of a chimney became coated with creosote and soot over time, which was flammable, so using non-combustible materials for the structure itself was important. They learned about sizing the flue, the actual opening in the chimney. Too large and heat was wasted, drawn up the chimney unnecessarily. Too small and smoke might not exit efficiently. The optimal size depended on the size of the fire, the height of the chimney, and various other factors. Master masons developed rules of thumb, passing knowledge from master to apprentice. And they learned about chimney caps and designs to prevent rain from coming straight down the chimney. A simple cover with openings on the sides allowed smoke out while keeping most rain from entering. More elaborate designs used multiple levels or clever shapes to manage both smoke and weather. With the chimney came the fireplace as we know it. A recessed area in a wall where a fire could burn, surrounded by a decorative surround and mantel. The fireplace became a focal point of a room, both functionally and aesthetically. The firebox itself, the actual area where the fire burned, was typically lined with fire brick, a special type of brick designed to withstand high temperatures repeatedly without cracking. The back wall of the firebox was often angled slightly forward at the top, creating what's called a smoke shelf. This helped to reflect heat into the room and also prevented downdrafts from blowing smoke back into the space. The opening of the fireplace was carefully proportioned. Too large and much of the heat would go up the chimney. Too small and the fire couldn't burn properly, lacking sufficient oxygen. The depth of the firebox also mattered. Too shallow and heat radiated efficiently into the room, but logs rolled out easily. Too deep and much heat was lost to the back wall. Around the fireplace opening, there would be a surround decorative stone or woodwork that framed the fire. This wasn't just aesthetic. It also protected the wall itself from heat. And above the surround was the mantel, a shelf that served both practical and decorative purposes. It protected the wall above from heat. It provided a display space for objects, and it completed the visual composition of the fireplace. In wealthy homes, the fireplace surround and mantel became opportunities for display of wealth and taste. They might be carved from marble, white Carrara, green serpentine, pink or grey variety. The carving might be simple or elaborate, with columns, garlands, family comb coats of arms, or complex sculptural elements. Even in more modest homes, the fireplace was usually given some decorative attention. The surround might be simple brick or stone, but it would be neatly laid, perhaps with slightly fancier bricks, creating a pattern or border. The mantel might be simple wood, but it would be plain smooth and perhaps given a decorative edge or molding. The fireplace became the natural gathering point of a room. Chairs were arranged facing it or at angles to it. In cold weather, everyone naturally gravitated toward it. The fire was no longer an open flame in the middle of a space that you had to be careful around. It was contained and safe, and you could sit right beside it. The great revolution that chimneys enabled was the heating of multiple rooms independently. Before chimneys, practical considerations meant most households had a single large fire in a central hall. With chimneys, you could have a fire in many different rooms, each with its own chimney drawing the smoke safely away. This changed architecture fundamentally. Suddenly, houses could be divided into more, smaller rooms, rather than dominated by one large hall. Privacy became more achievable. A family of means could have a parlor for entertaining, a dining room for meals, a library or study, multiple bedchambers, each with its own fireplace. This proliferation of fireplaces had implications for both comfort and labor. On one hand, it was now possible to be warm in a small private room, or rather than having to gather in a communal space. You could read in your study with a fire burning just for you. You could sleep in your chamber with a fire keeping that room warm, rather than relying on bed curtains and piles of blankets alone. On the other hand, each fireplace needed to be tended. In a large house with a dozen fireplaces, keeping them all going during winter was considerable work. Wood or coal had to be carried to each room. Each fire had to be lit in the morning, tended throughout the day, banked at night. Ashes had to be removed regularly. All of this was servants' work, but it was extensive work nonetheless. Wealthier households might employ servants specifically for this purpose. Housemaids, whose primary responsibility was maintaining fires. In large estates, there might be a fireman or firekeeper, though this term had a different meaning than it does today. It referred to someone responsible for ensuring all the household fires were properly maintained. While England, France, and much of Western Europe were developing fireplace technology, in Northern Europe, particularly in the Germanic states, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and parts of Eastern Europe, a different approach emerged. The enclosed ceramic stove. These stoves, often called Kachelofen in German or Kakelugn in Swedish, represented a fundamentally different philosophy of heating. Instead of an open fire that radiated heat directly, they used a fire burning inside an enclosed chamber, with the heat radiating from the exterior surfaces of the stove itself. The construction of a traditional tile stove was a specialized craft. The stove was built in place, essentially a large structure of ceramic tiles carefully fitted together. The tiles themselves were often glazed in beautiful colors. Deep greens, rich browns, warm oranges, or bright blues. They might be decorated with patterns, with scenes, with religious imagery. Inside this ceramic shell was a complex arrangement of channels and chambers. The fire burned in a relatively small firebox, often loaded from the side or back. The hot gases from this fire didn't exit immediately through a chimney. Instead, they were routed through a series of passages within the stove, traveling up and down, back and forth, before finally exiting through a flue at the top. This circuitous path meant the hot gases gave up nearly all their heat to the ceramic mass of the stove before escaping. The ceramic would slowly warm up, absorbing and storing this heat. Then, over many hours, it would radiate that heat into the room. The advantage of this design is efficiency. A well-designed tile stove, fired intensely once or twice a day, could keep a room warm continuously. The ceramic mass stored so much heat that it would still be warm to the touch, 12 or even 18 hours after the fire had burned out. You could fire the stove in the morning and evening, and the space would remain comfortable through the day and night. This was particularly valuable in very cold climates. In a Scandinavian winter, where temperatures might stay below freezing for months, the ability to heat efficiently was crucial. A tile stove used far less wood than an open fireplace for the same amount of warmth. And wood was often scarce. The surface of a tile stove rarely became dangerously hot. It was warm to the touch, but not burning hot. This meant you could safely press against it, lean on it, even sit on special benches built beside or into the stove structure. In cold weather, the area immediately around the stove became the most desirable place to be. Some tile stoves were enormous, almost architectural features. They might stretch from floor to ceiling, occupying a significant portion of a room. Some were built to serve multiple rooms, the stove body in one room, but with surfaces that radiated heat into adjacent spaces. The firebox might be loaded from a kitchen or service area, while the main body of the stove warmed a living room or bedchamber. The craftsmanship in these stoves could be extraordinary. The tiles might be individually crafted by skilled ceramicists, each one decorated before being glazed and fired. The tiles would then be assembled by a stove setter, a specialized tradesman who understood not just how to build the structure, but how to design the internal passages for optimal heat extraction. A tile stove was expensive, far more so than a simple fireplace. But for those who could afford one, it represented a significant improvement in domestic comfort. The even gentle warmth they provided, the efficiency of their fuel use, and often their sheer beauty made them prized possessions, sometimes passed down through generations. As heating systems improved, there was a growing understanding of the importance of controlling airflow. Medieval buildings had been drafty almost by necessity. All those gaps and cracks and deliberately open spaces had allowed smoke to escape. But with chimneys handling smoke removal, it became possible and desirable to seal buildings more thoroughly. Windows, which had once been simply openings that could be shuttered against weather, began to be fitted with glass. Glass had been used in churches and important buildings for centuries, but it was expensive. However, as glass-making technology improved, particularly in the Low Countries and later in England, glass became gradually more affordable. Early window glass was not like modern glass. It was often greenish in color, full of bubbles and imperfections. It might be wavy, distorting the view through it. But even imperfect glass had a wonderful property. It allowed light to pass through while keeping wind and rain and cold air out. A room with glazed windows was dramatically more comfortable than one with merely shuttered openings. The glass was set in lead canes, strips of lead that held small panes of glass in place. Each pane might be only a few inches across. Large sheets of glass were difficult to make and expensive. These small panes were assembled into larger windows through the lead framework. The lead was soft enough to be worked by hand but strong enough to hold the glass securely. For the wealthy, windows might be glazed year-round. For those of more modest means, glass windows might be removable, installed in winter for warmth and taken out in summer for ventilation. Some people even took their windows with them when they move, the glass being valuable enough to be worth the effort. Curtains also became more important, not just for privacy but for insulation. Heavy wool or velvet curtains drawn across a window at night could significantly reduce heat loss. The curtain trapped a layer of still air between itself and the glass, and this air layer provided insulation. During the day, curtains could be drawn back to allow light in. At night, they would be closed to keep warmth in. Doors received similar attention. In medieval buildings, doors had often fitted poorly, with large gaps around the edges. Now, efforts were made to fit doors more precisely. Weather stripping began to be used. Strips of leather or felt attached to the doorframe to seal gaps. Some doors were hung on better hinges that allowed them to close more tightly and truly. Vestibules and entrance halls became more common in cold climates. These created an airlock effect. You entered through an outer door into a small space, then through an inner door into the main house. This prevented cold air from rushing directly into living spaces every time someone entered or left. The vestibule itself might be unheated or only minimally heated, but it served as a buffer zone. Another significant change in the early modern period was the increasing use of coal as a fuel, particularly in England. For most of European history, wood had been the primary fuel. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, England was facing a timber shortage. Forests had been cut down for agriculture, for shipbuilding, for construction, for charcoal production, for iron smelting. Coal had been known and used for centuries, but it had been considered inferior to wood. It was dirty, it smelled bad, it produced acrid smoke, and it behaved differently in a fire. But it was available in quantity. England had extensive coal deposits, particularly in the north and in Wales. And as wood became scarce and expensive, coal became economically attractive despite its drawbacks. The use of coal required adaptations. Coal burns hotter than wood in many ways, but it also burns differently. It needs good airflow from below to burn efficiently. So coal grates were developed. Metal baskets that held the coal and allowed air to flow up through it from below. These grates sat in the fireplace, raising the coal off the hearth floor. Coal also required different chimney management. It produced more soot and creosote than wood, so chimneys needed to be cleaned more frequently. The occupation of chimney sweep became more common and more necessary. Chimney sweeps, often employing young boys who could fit inside the narrow flues, would climb up chimneys with brushes to scrape away the accumulated soot. This was dangerous work. The boys, and they were often very young, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old, would be sent up chimneys that were dark, cramped, and sometimes still warm from recent fires. They could get stuck. They could suffocate from soot inhalation. They could fall. It was one of those occupations that we look back on with horror. And yet it was common practice for centuries. Coal also changed the character of cities where it was heavily used. London, in particular, became infamous for its coal smoke. So much coal was burned that the city was often covered in a pall of smoke. Foreign visitors commented on the foul air, the smell of sulfur, the way everything became coated with soot. People's lungs were damaged by breathing this air day after day, year after year, though the full extent of the health effects wouldn't be understood for centuries. Despite these drawbacks, coal had advantages beyond its availability. A given weight of coal provided more heat than the same weight of wood. It was more energy dense. For cities where transporting large quantities of wood was becoming logistically difficult, coal was practical. It could be brought in by ship or barge, unloaded at wharves, and distributed through the city. And so, gradually, coal became the dominant fuel in many English cities and towns. The domestic fire changed from the pleasant crackling wood fire to the denser, hotter, smokier coal fire. The smell changed, the color of the smoke changed, but people adapted. They learned to manage coal fires, to know how much coal to add and when, to rake the ashes and keep the grate clear. By the 18th century, a coal fire was simply normal for most urban English people. They didn't remember or romanticize wood fires. Coal was just what you burned. The changes that seemed dramatic when they first occurred became simply the way things were, and a new generation grew up knowing nothing else. The 18th century was a period of what we call the Enlightenment, an age when educated people believed that reason and science could improve human life, when traditional ways of doing things were questioned and tested against rational principles. This philosophy extended even to something as mundane as keeping warm. One of the most famous figures in this story is Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was many things: a printer, a writer, a scientist, a diplomat, a revolutionary, but he was also intensely practical, interested in devices and inventions that could make daily life better. And in 1740 he turned his attention to the problem of heating. Franklin had observed that traditional fireplaces were wasteful. They consumed enormous amounts of wood, yet provided relatively little heat to the room. Much of the heat went straight up the chimney, wasted. Meanwhile, the fire created drafts. It pulled cold air in from outside to feed itself, actually making the room colder except in the immediate vicinity of the fire. In a pamphlet describing his observations, Franklin wrote about sitting near a fireplace and feeling hot on one side, the side facing the fire, while feeling cold on the other side. The room as a whole remained chilly despite a roaring fire. This seemed to him both uncomfortable and inefficient, a problem that a rational approach might solve. His solution was what became known as the Franklin stove, though the original version was actually called the Pennsylvania fireplace. It was a freestanding metal structure designed to sit inside an existing fireplace or in the middle of a room. Made of cast iron, it had a complex internal structure designed to extract maximum heat from the burning wood. The key innovation was in the airflow. Cold air from the room was drawn in at the bottom, passed through channels where it was heated by contact with hot metal surfaces, then released into the room as warm air. Meanwhile, the smoke followed a separate path, down and around in a circuitous route before exiting through a pipe that connected to the chimney. This long smoke path allowed the smoke to give up much of its heat before escaping. The design had some flaws. The original version didn't actually work quite as well as Franklin hoped, and it was later modified by others. But the principle was sound. It demonstrated that systematic thinking could improve efficiency. You didn't just have to accept the traditional fireplace. You could analyze how heat moved, how air flowed, and design something better. Franklin, remarkably, refused to patent his stove. The governor of Pennsylvania offered him a patent that could have made Franklin wealthy, but he declined. He wrote that we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, and we should be glad to serve others in the same way. It was a philosophy that seems almost quaint today, but it was not uncommon among Enlightenment thinkers who saw themselves as working for the common good. The Franklin stove and its descendants became popular, particularly in America. They were more efficient than open fireplaces. They radiated heat from all sides rather than just from the front, and they could be placed anywhere in a room rather than requiring a full fireplace structure. For a growing nation with abundant wood, but limited skilled masons to build fireplaces, the Franklin stove was practical and democratic. Another remarkable figure was Benjamin Thompson, who later became Count Rumford. Thompson was an American who remained loyal to Britain during the Revolutionary War, fled to Europe, and eventually entered the service of the Elector of Bavaria. He was a curious character, part scientist, part social reformer, part self-promoter. But his work on heat and heating was genuinely important. Rumford became interested in the nature of heat itself. At the time, most scientists believed heat was a fluid called caloric that flowed from hot objects to cold ones. Rumford's experiments, particularly his famous observation of heat, generated by boring cannons, began to undermine this theory and suggest that heat was actually a form of motion, what we now understand as molecular motion. But beyond theoretical physics, Rumford was interested in practical applications. In Bavaria, he established workhouses for the poor, and part of his goal was to house and feed these people as efficiently as possible. This led him to study cooking stoves and heating systems systematically. He turned his attention to fireplaces and found them sadly deficient. In a series of essays and published papers, he analyzed exactly what was wrong with typical fireplaces. They were too deep. So much of the heat radiated toward the back of the fireplace where it was wasted. They were too bad, allowing cold air to rush in around the front. Their throats, the opening where the smoke entered the chimney, were poorly proportioned. Through experimentation, Rumford developed what became known as the Rumford fireplace. Its proportions were specific and based on his observations of airflow and heat radiation. The fireplace was shallow, much shallower than traditional fireplaces. The back wall was nearly vertical, rising straight up before angling inward toward the throat. The sides were angled to reflect heat forward into the room. The throat itself, the crucial passage from fireplace to chimney, was narrow and carefully shaped. It was just large enough to allow smoke to escape efficiently, but no larger. Preventing excessive draft and heat loss above the throat was a smoke shelf, a flat area that prevented downdrafts from blowing smoke back into the room. These proportions, carefully worked out through experiment and observation, genuinely improved fireplace performance. A Rumford fireplace provided noticeably more heat to a room than a traditional fireplace, burning the same amount of fuel. The difference was substantial enough that people who had them installed noticed immediately. Rumford fireplaces became fashionable among those who could afford to renovate their homes or build new ones. Thomas Jefferson installed Rumford fireplaces at Monticello. In England, Rumford's designs influenced fireplace construction for decades. Even today, when someone builds a traditional masonry fireplace, the proportions are often based on Rumford's principles. Rumford also turned his attention to clothing and insulation. He conducted experiments on the insulating properties of different materials. He recognized that still air was an excellent insulator. Something that seems obvious now, but was not well understood then. He showed that the warmth provided by fur or wool came not from the material itself, but from the air trapped within and between the fibers. This led him to advocate for multiple thin layers of clothing rather than single thick layers. The air trapped between layers provided insulation more effectively than thick single garments. He also designed clothing for the poor in his workhouses based on these principles: practical, warm, and economical. Toward the end of the 18th century, a new technology began to emerge that would eventually revolutionize heating: the hot water system. The principle was simple. Heat water in a central boiler, allow the hot water to circulate through pipes to different rooms, and let it give up its heat through radiators or other heat exchangers before returning to be reheated. The circulation could happen naturally through convection. Hot water is less dense than cold water, so hot water rises while cold water sinks. This means you could create a circulation without pumps or mechanical devices, just through the natural properties of heated water. The earliest systems were installed in large buildings, factories, greenhouses, and institutional buildings. Matthew Boulton and James Watt, famous for their improvements to the steam engine, installed one of the first documented hot water heating systems in a friend's factory in 1784. The system worked well for heating the large open space of the factory floor. For residential use, such systems were still rare. They were expensive to install, requiring a boiler, extensive piping, and radiators or other heat emitters in each room. They required maintenance. The boiler had to be tended, water levels monitored, and the system drained if there was risk of freezing. Few homes had such systems in the 18th century, but the seeds were planted. The concept existed, the technology was proven, and gradually, over the 19th century, central heating systems would become more common, particularly in larger homes and in colder climates, where the investment in such a system could be justified by the improved comfort it provided. For most people, the real improvement in heating during the 18th century came from improved stoves, particularly in kitchens. The kitchen fireplace, where cooking was done, began to be replaced by or supplemented with enclosed stoves made of cast iron. These stoves were more efficient than open fires. The iron absorbed heat from the fire and radiated it into the room. The stove typically had a flat top where pots could be placed directly over the fire, improving cooking efficiency. Some had built-in ovens, enclosed spaces where the heat from the fire was captured and could be used for baking. The temperature in these ovens couldn't be controlled precisely. There were no thermostats, but an experienced cook learned to judge the heat. They might hold their hand near the oven door, counting how long they could hold it there before the heat became uncomfortable. They might test by throwing a bit of flour on the oven floor and seeing how quickly it browned. They developed an intimate knowledge of their particular stove, learning its quirks and characteristics. These kitchen stoves also provided heating for the kitchen itself, which was often the warmest room in the house. The stove burned all day for cooking, and this incidental heat made the kitchen comfortable even in winter. In many households, particularly those of modest means, the kitchen became the main living space in cold weather, with family members gathering there not just for meals, but for warmth. In America particularly, stoves became popular. America had abundant wood and iron ore, but it lacked the tradition of skilled masonry and the large stone structures common in Europe. Cast iron stoves could be manufactured in foundries and shipped where they were needed. They were practical, efficient, and suited to the American context of scattered settlements and relatively rough housing. By the late 18th century, a visitor to an American home would likely find a cast iron stove rather than a traditional fireplace, serving as the main heat source. These stoves came in many designs, some purely functional, others with decorative elements. Molded patterns, feet shaped like animal paws, finials, and ornamentation that made them more than purely utilitarian objects. By the time Queen Victoria ascended to the British throne in 1837, the fireplace had evolved from a purely functional necessity to a central symbol of domestic life and virtue. The Victorian era idealized the home as a sanctuary from the harsh industrial world outside, and the hearth was the heart of this sanctuary. This wasn't just poetic fancy, it was deeply felt cultural belief. The fireplace represented warmth, obviously, but also family unity, moral goodness, and the proper order of society. Victorian literature, art, and popular culture are full of images of families gathered around the hearth. Christmas cards depicted cozy firelit scenes. Novels described characters sitting by fires, the fire's warmth and light standing in for safety, comfort, and belonging. A proper Victorian middle-class home would have multiple fireplaces, one in every principal room. The parlour where guests were received would have the grandest fireplace. The dining room would have its own. Each bedroom upstairs would ideally have a small fireplace. Even the nursery would have a fire where it could be safely tended. The parlour fireplace was a showpiece. The surround might be carved marble, perhaps white with grey veining or black Belgian marble for a more sombre and formal appearance. The mantelpiece would be substantial, providing a platform for displaying objects that demonstrated the family's taste and refinement. On the mantel might sit a clock, an important piece, as keeping time was important to the Victorian sense of order and productivity. There might be decorative vases, perhaps filled with dried flowers or grasses. Photographs in decorative frames became common as the century progressed, and photography became more accessible. Small decorative objects, ceramic figurines, shells collected on holiday, souvenirs of travel, all found places on the mantel. Above the mantel, a large mirror was common. This served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Practically, it reflected light from the fire and from windows, brightening the room. Aesthetically, it made the room seem larger and more elegant. The mirror's frame might be elaborate, gilt wood with carved ornamental details, or a frame integrated into the marble surround itself. The fire tools, poker, tongs, brush, and shovel, would be displayed beside the fireplace in a matching stand. These were not kept hidden away, but shown as part of the fireplace composition. They might be brass, kept polished to a bright shine, or iron with decorative details. Using and maintaining these tools was part of the ritual of the fire. A fire screen might stand nearby. This was a frame holding an embroidered or tapestried panel, sometimes hinged or on a pole, so it could be adjusted. Its purpose was to protect ladies' complexions from the direct heat of the fire, which was thought to damage the skin. It also provided a decorative element and gave ladies of the household something to embroider. Creating fire screens was a common needlework project. The hearthrug in front of the fireplace was another important element. It was positioned to catch any sparks that might escape, protecting the floor or carpet. But it was also decorative. In wealthy homes, it might be a Persian or Turkish carpet, rich with color and pattern. In more modest homes, it might be a hooked or braided rug, often homemade, but still chosen or made with care. The fireplace dictated the arrangement of the entire room. Comfortable chairs and a sofa were positioned to benefit from its warmth. Side tables held oil lamps for reading. Everything was oriented toward the fireplace as the natural focal point. To enter a Victorian parlour was to immediately understand that the fireplace was the centre, and everything else organised itself in relation to it. But maintaining all these fires was considerable work. And in the Victorian era, this work was done almost entirely by servants. particularly by housemaids who occupied the lower ranks of the household hierarchy. A housemaid's day began very early, often before dawn. Her first task before the family woke was to deal with the fireplaces. She would move through the house room by room, carrying the tools of her trade. A coal scuttle, a bucket for ashes, a dustpan and brush, tongs and poker. At each fireplace, she would first carefully remove the previous day's ashes. This had to be done delicately because there might still be live coals buried in the ash, and she needed to save these for restarting the fire. The cold ashes would be scooped into the ash bucket, being careful not to raise dust. Then she would clean the hearth itself, sweeping away any fallen ash or coal. The fender, the low metal rail around the hearth, would be wiped down. If it was brass, it would need occasional polishing to keep it bright. The fire tools would be straightened, placed in their proper positions. Next came laying the fire. This was done according to a specific method, a skill that housemaids learned and took pride in. First, a layer of crumpled newspaper or paper scraps in the grate. Then bone, small kindling. Thin sticks or chips of wood arranged in a loose structure that would allow air to flow through. Then slightly larger pieces of wood. Finally, coal would be arranged on top, starting with smaller pieces that would catch more easily. If there were still live coals from the previous day's fire, these could be placed in the center to help ignite the new fire. Otherwise, she would have to use a match. Matches, having become cheap and readily available in the Victorian era, had revolutionized fire starting. Once lit, the fire had to be monitored until it was burning well. The housemaid might need to add more kindling, to use the bellows, to encourage the flames, to adjust the coal to ensure good airflow. Only when the fire was burning satisfactorily could she move on to the next room and repeat the process. In a large house, this sequence might be repeated a dozen times or more. And this was just the morning preparation. Throughout the day, fires needed tending. Coal added, ashes raked, the proper level of fire maintained. In the evening, fires would be built up again. At night, they would be banked carefully to last until morning, or allowed to die out if the room would not be used. There was also the hauling. Coal came from the cellar, brought up in scuttles that held perhaps 20 or 30 pounds of coal. A single scuttle might last only a day or two for one fireplace in cold weather. In a house with many fireplaces, the amount of coal that had to be carried up from the cellar each day was substantial. The housemaid would make trip after trip, carrying heavy scuttles upstairs, sometimes multiple flights. The ash went the other direction, carried down to the ash pit or bin in the cellar. Ash is lighter than coal, but bulky, and the buckets still had to be carried down those same stairs. A housemaid's legs and back grew strong from all this climbing and carrying, and everything had to be done discreetly. The ideal was that the family would wake to warm rooms with fires already burning cheerfully. As if by magic, they shouldn't see the housemaid's labor, shouldn't be disturbed by her presence. She had to move quietly, work efficiently, and be invisible except when explicitly needed. For the housemaid herself, it was exhausting work. Her hands became rough from handling coal and ash, from scrubbing hearths and polishing grates. Her knees hurt from kneeling before fireplaces. Her eyes and lungs were irritated by ash and coal dust. In summer, when fires were less necessary, the work was easier, but in winter it was relentless. Yet for many working-class girls in the Victorian era, being a housemaid was a decent position. It provided employment, room and board, a small wage. It was hard work, but so was most work available to working-class women. And in a good household, a housemaid might learn skills, might advance to higher positions, might even save a bit of money toward her future. The Victorian era saw the perfection of the enclosed cast iron kitchen range, which became standard in middle-class homes. These ranges were remarkable pieces of engineering, serving multiple functions simultaneously: cooking, baking, heating water, and warming the kitchen. A typical Victorian range was a substantial piece of equipment, made of heavy cast iron, perhaps 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. It would be built into the kitchen wall with chimneys connecting it to the main house chimney system. The range would be permanently installed, not something that could be moved. It was part of the architecture of the kitchen. At the heart of the range was the firebox, where coal burned. The fire could be accessed through a door at the front, allowing coal to be added and ashes to be removed. Above the firebox were hot plates, flat cast iron surfaces where pots and pans could be placed directly over the fire. These hot plates were often circular, with removable concentric rings that could be taken out to allow a pot to sit closer to the fire for more direct heat. To one side or both sides of the firebox were ovens. These were enclosed spaces surrounded by metal that absorbed heat from the fire. A well-designed range directed heat around and over the oven efficiently. The oven door would have a temperature gauge, a simple mechanical thermometer that gave some indication of the heat inside, though it was not precise by modern standards. Many ranges also included a water reservoir, a metal tank adjacent to the firebox that held water. The heat from the fire would warm this water, providing a supply of hot water for cooking and cleaning. The water could be drawn out through a tap at the front of the range. This was a significant convenience. Hot water on demand, without having to heat it separately in a pot. Some ranges had additional features: a plate warmer on top to keep dishes warm, a towel rail at the front where wet towels could be dried, even a small compartment for keeping food warm. Operating a Victorian range required skill and experience. The cook had to manage the fire carefully, maintaining enough heat for all the functions, but not allowing it to burn so hot that food scorched or the range became damaged. She had to understand how heat flowed through the range, knowing that the oven might be hotter on one side than the other, that certain hot plates were hotter than others. Baking was particularly challenging. Without precise temperature control, the cook had to judge oven heat by experience and make adjustments as needed. She might move items around in the oven during baking, or she might adjust the fire, or she might simply know that bread needed to go in at a certain time of day when the fire was at a particular stage of burning. The range also required constant attention. The fire needed to be maintained throughout the day. Coal needed to be added regularly. Ashes accumulated and had to be removed. The hot plates needed to be cleaned, scrubbed free of spills and burnt on food. The exterior of the range, which was usually black cast iron, needed to be blacked, treated with a special polish that kept it from rusting and maintained its appearance. Blacking the range was done regularly, often weekly. The process involved brushing on a mixture of graphite and other materials, then buffing it to a deep black shine. It was messy work. The blacking got on hands and clothes, and you ended up covered in black smudges. but a properly blacked range was a source of pride. It showed that the household was well maintained, that standards were being kept. The kitchen, with its constantly burning range, was the warmest room in most Victorian houses. It was also the most worked-in room, the domain of the cook and kitchen maids who spent their days there. The heat in summer could be oppressive. Standing over a hot range on a summer day, when outdoor temperatures might be in the 80s or higher, made the kitchen almost unbearable. But in winter, the kitchen was the most comfortable room in the house, and servants often lingered there when their work allowed. Despite all the fireplaces and ranges, Victorian bedrooms were often quite cold. This was partly deliberate. There was a strong belief in the Victorian era that sleeping in a cold room was healthful. Fresh air, even cold air, was considered vital for health. Many Victorians slept with windows open even in winter, convinced that this would prevent disease and promote vigor. To make cold beds bearable, Victorian households relied heavily on hot water bottles and bed warmers, which reached their peak of development and use in this era. The hot water bottle of the Victorian period was typically made of stoneware or earthenware, heavy, solid ceramic with a cork or rubber stopper. These bottles were shaped rather like a flask, flat and oval, designed to fit comfortably in a bed. The process of preparing a hot water bottle was simple but required care. Water would be heated on the kitchen range until boiling or nearly so. Using a funnel, the hot water would be poured into the bottle until it was full. The stopper would be firmly inserted, and the bottle would be checked for leaks. The bottle would then be wrapped in a flannel bag or towel to prevent burns and to extend the time it stayed warm. A properly prepared hot water bottle could stay noticeably warm for 4 or 5 hours, sometimes longer. It would be placed in the bed, usually at the foot where it could warm the feet, perhaps half an hour before bedtime so the bed would already be warm when you got in. The sensation of getting into a bed with a hot water bottle already warming the sheets was a small but genuine luxury. Instead of the shock of cold sheets against your skin, you encountered warmth. Your feet, finding the hot water bottle, were immediately comfortable instead of slowly growing numb with cold. As the night progressed, the bottle would gradually cool. By morning, it would be just warm or room temperature. But those first hours of sleep, when warmth was most needed to help you relax and drift off, the bottle provided real comfort. Later in the Victorian era, rubber hot water bottles became available. These were lighter than ceramic ones and less likely to break if dropped. They could also conform better to the shape of the body. However, they were prone to developing leaks, and there were occasional issues with rubber degrading over time, especially when exposed to very hot water repeatedly. The bed warming pan, though becoming somewhat old-fashioned by the late Victorian era, was still used in more conservative or traditional households. The warming pan had evolved from earlier versions. Victorian warming pans often had more elaborate designs. Decorative piercing in the lid that created patterns. Handles carved or turned on a lathe, brass or copper, polished to a bright shine. The technique of using a warming pan remained the same. Hot coals in the pan moved systematically between the sheets to warm the bed. It was more labor-intensive than a hot water bottle, but was sometimes preferred because it warmed a larger area of the bed more quickly. While much of this exploration has focused on Western Europe and America, it's important to recognize that other regions developed their own distinctive approaches to warmth, shaped by their climates, available materials, and cultural traditions. One of the most remarkable is the Russian masonry stove, known as a pechka, or simply a Russian stove. The Russian winter is legendary for its severity. Temperatures in much of Russia remain well below freezing for months at a time. In such conditions, heating is not merely about comfort, but about survival itself. The Russian stove was designed specifically for this harsh reality. A traditional Russian stove is an enormous structure, far larger than anything we might think of as a stove. It might weigh several tons, built from brick or stone, sometimes taking up a quarter of the floor space in a small cottage. But this massive size is precisely the point. The principle behind the Russian stove is thermal mass. The ability of a large amount of brick or stone to absorb heat and then release it slowly over many hours. When a fire is burned in the stove, the heat doesn't just warm the air immediately. It warms the entire massive structure of the stove itself. Once heated, this mass will radiate warmth for 12 to 24 hours or even longer. This meant that in a traditional Russian home, you might fire the stove thoroughly once or perhaps twice a day, rather than maintaining a constant fire. You would build a substantial beer in the morning, feeding it generously with wood, allowing it to burn hot for several hours. The stove would heat up thoroughly. Then the fire would be allowed to die down and out, but the stove would continue warming the space for the rest of the day and into the night. The construction of a traditional Russian stove is complex. Inside the apparent solid mass are actually chambers and channels through which hot gases flow. When a fire burns, the smoke and hot gases don't go straight up a chimney. Instead, they are routed through these internal passages, traveling up and down, back and forth, before finally exiting through a chimney. This labyrinthine path ensures that the hot gases give up nearly all their heat to the brick or stone structure before escaping. By the time the smoke end exits, it has cooled considerably, having transferred its thermal energy to the mass of the stove. The Russian stove was multifunctional in a way that made it the true center of home life. It wasn't just for heating. It was all where cooking happened. The stove would have an oven chamber where bread could be baked, shaked, where pots of soup or porridge could be left to cook slowly, using the heat stored in the stove's mass. Some stoves had special recesses where certain dishes would be placed to cook overnight, emerging perfectly prepared in the morning. Many Russian stoves had a sleeping platform on top, the lezhanka. This was accessed by a small ladder or steps built into the side of the stove. The platform was large enough for a person to lie down, and being directly atop the warm mass of the stove, it was by far the warmest place in the home. The lezhanka was typically reserved for the elderly or for anyone who was ill. In Russian folk tales and literature, the image of the grandmother or grandfather sitting or lying atop the warm stove is common. It represents comfort and care, the respect and consideration given to elders. To allow someone to sleep on the lezhanka was a sign of particular concern for their welfare. Building a proper Russian stove required specialized knowledge passed from master to apprentice. The stonemason or bricklayer who built stoves was an important figure in the community. They had to understand not just how to lay brick, but how to design the internal channels for optimal heat extraction. How to size the firebox and the chimney. How to ensure the structure was stable despite its great weight. A well-built Russian stove was a treasure, often serving a family for generations. When a house was sold or abandoned, The stove might remain valuable enough that people would partially dismantle the house around it to salvage the bricks for building another stove elsewhere. On the other side of the Asian continent, in Korea, a completely different system developed that nonetheless shared some similarities with the Roman hypocaust. The ondol system of radiant floor heating. Ondol has been used in Korea for thousands of years, with archaeological evidence of similar systems dating back over 2,000 years. Like the Russian stove, it represents a solution carefully adapted to specific climate conditions and cultural practices. Traditional Korean homes were built with ondol as an integral part of their structure, not as an addition. The floor of the living and sleeping areas was raised above ground level, creating a space underneath. At one end of this space, typically in or near the kitchen area, was a firebox where a fire would be lit. The hot gases from this fire would be channeled beneath the floor, passing through stone-lined passages that run the length of the room or rooms. These passages ensured that the hot gases traveled across as much floor area as possible before exiting through a chimney at the far end of the structure. The floor itself was carefully constructed to take advantage of this heating. A layer of flat stones was laid in the passages, and these stones would absorb heat from the passing hot gases. Above the stones came layers of clay mixed with earth, then more stones, and finally the floor surface itself, which was traditionally covered with oiled paper. This paper floor covering is interesting. It was made from thick paper that was then treated with oil, making it both durable and water-resistant. The paper was smooth and pleasant to touch, and it could be replaced when it became worn, allowing the floor to be renewed periodically. Korean traditional culture involved sitting and sleeping directly on the floor, rather than using raised furniture like chairs and beds. This made the heated floor ideal. You were in direct contact with the warmth. Sitting on a warm floor on a cold winter day, feeling that gentle heat rising through the paper and into your body, was extraordinarily comfortable. The ondol fire was typically started in the morning and allowed to burn for several hours. The fire was used for cooking, so this served a dual purpose, preparing meals while also heating the living space. After the cooking fire died down, the stored heat in the stones beneath the floor would continue warming the space for many hours. The warmth from an ondol floor is even and gentle, quite different from the direct heat of a fire or stove. There are no hot and cold spots in the room. The entire floor is warm and thus the entire space is comfortable. This evening out of temperature was one of the great advantages of the system. Different areas of the floor might be at different temperatures. The area nearest the firebox would be warmest, while the area near the chimney, where the gases had already given up most of their heat, would be cooler. This temperature gradient was used deliberately. The warmest spot might be where elderly family members would sit or sleep, while others would arrange themselves according to the warmth they preferred. In modern Korea, the principle of ondol continues, though the implementation has changed. Instead of hot gases from a fire, modern ondol uses hot water flowing through pipes beneath the floor. But the result is the same, a heated floor that warms the entire space evenly and comfortably. Radiant floor heating is now standard in Korean buildings, from apartments to offices, a continuation of an ancient tradition adapted with modern technology. In Japan, traditional architecture was quite different from that of Korea. Japanese homes, particularly in older styles, were built with paper walls, shoji screens made of wood frames covered with translucent paper. These allowed light to filter through, but provided minimal insulation. The floors were raised wood, with air circulating beneath, and rooms could be opened entirely to the outside by sliding away the outer walls. This style of architecture was beautiful and well-suited to Japan's hot, humid summers. It allowed maximum airflow, helped prevent humidity buildup that could cause rot or mold, and created a sense of connection with nature. But it was decidedly problematic in winter. Heating such a space effectively was nearly impossible with the technology available. A fire in one corner of a room would provide some warmth nearby, but would hardly heat the space as a whole when walls were permeable and floors were raised. The Japanese approach, therefore, was to create zones of warmth rather than trying to heat entire spaces. The most characteristic of these is the kotatsu, a solution that is both practical and social. A kotatsu consists of a low table with a heat source underneath it and a thick blanket or futon draped over the table. The traditional heat source was a charcoal brazier placed in a depression in the floor directly under the table. Though modern kotatsu use electric heating elements, the blanket extends to the floor on all sides, creating an enclosed space under the table. When you sit at the kotatsu, you sit with your legs under the table and under the blanket, with the warmth trapped in this small volume. Your upper body remains outside in the cool room air, but your legs and lap are warm. Multiple people can sit around a kotatsu, all sharing the same pool of warmth under the blanket. This creates an intimate social space. Families would gather around the kotatsu for meals, for tea, for conversation, for simply being together. There's something inherently social about shared warmth, about literally being under the same blanket. The kotatsu is remarkably efficient in its way. You are only heating a small volume of air, the space under the table, and that space is shared by several people whose body heat adds to the warmth. Meanwhile, the rest of the room can remain quite cold, but this is acceptable because that's not where you are. For sleeping, traditional Japanese households used similar principles. Rather than heating the room, you focused on heating the sleeping space. A futon would be laid on the tatami mat floor and heavy blankets piled on top. You would sleep inside this pile of blankets, your body heat trapped by the layers, keeping you warm despite the cold room. In some cases, a hibachi, a small charcoal brazier, might be used to warm a room slightly, but always with great care about ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The hibachi was more commonly used for heating water for tea or for cooking small items than for space heating. The Japanese approach accepted that the space itself would be cold and focused instead on warming the person. You wore layers of clothing, cotton undergarments, then silk kimonos, then perhaps additional outer layers. You gathered around shared heat sources like the kotatsu. You created small zones of warmth rather than trying to warm everything. This approach persisted remarkably long. Even as Japan modernized rapidly in the 20th century, many homes continued using kotatsu well into the modern era, and indeed many still do, valuing both their efficiency and the social cohesion they create. It's only more recently that central heating has become standard in Japanese homes, and even now, the kotatsu remains culturally significant, a symbol of family and winter coziness. Indigenous peoples of North America developed a wide variety of approaches to warmth, adapted to the specific climates and materials available in their regions. These ranged from the portable structures of nomadic plains peoples to the semi-permanent dwellings of more settled groups. The teepee used by many plains tribes is more sophisticated than it might first appear. The conical shape is aerodynamically stable. It stands up to the intense winds of the Great Plain better than many other structures. The covering, traditionally made from buffalo hides and later from canvas, provided decent insulation, especially when multiple layers were used. What's particularly clever is how the teepee was designed for fire. An opening at the top allowed smoke to escape, and this opening had adjustable smoke flaps, extensions of the covering that could be positioned using external poles. By adjusting these flaps, you could control the draft and ensure smoke exited efficiently regardless of wind direction. Inside the teepee there was often an inner liner, hung about 6 feet high around the interior wall. This served multiple purposes. It provided additional insulation through the air gap created between the liner and the outer covering. It also directed airflow. Fresh air entering at ground level would flow up between the outer covering and the liner, then down the inside of the liner across the living space, and into the fire at the center, which drew it upward and out through the smoke hole. This circulation kept the air relatively fresh while maintaining warmth. The fire didn't need to be large. A relatively small fire could keep a teepee surprisingly comfortable because of the effective insulation and the contained space. The floor might be covered with buffalo robes, creating a soft, insulating surface to sit and sleep on. In winter camps, snow would be banked around the base of the teepee, providing additional insulation. The entrance flap was positioned away from the prevailing wind. Inside, the warmest sleeping spots were farthest from the entrance, and these would typically be assigned by status and need. In the Arctic, the Inuit developed entirely different solutions for even harsher conditions. The igloo, a dome-shaped structure built from blocks of snow, seems like it should be terribly cold. But it's actually an effective shelter. Snow is full of air pockets, making it an excellent insulator. A well-built igloo with snow walls about 2 feet thick creates a surprisingly effective barrier against outside cold. Inside, the temperature can be far warmer than outside, even with minimal heating. The domed shape is structurally strong and creates a compact space with minimal surface area for heat loss. The entrance is typically a tunnel lower than the main living area, creating a cold trap. Cold air sinks and collects in the entrance while warm air stays in the dome above. With several people inside, body heat alone can raise the interior temperature significantly. A small seal oil lamp, the kulik, provides additional warmth and light. The lamp is a shallow dish carved from soapstone, filled with seal oil, with a wick made from moss or similar material. This lamp doesn't produce a large flame, just a steady, controlled burn that can last many hours on a small amount of oil. It provides warmth, melts ice for water, and allows cooking. It also provides light during the long Arctic darkness, creating a pool of warm illumination in an otherwise dark world. The Inuit also used similar insulation principles in their more permanent winter houses, partially underground structures with walls of sod, stone, and wood, with snow banked over them for additional insulation. These were darker than igloos, but provided better long-term shelter. To truly understand the historical methods of staying warm, it helps to know something about the basic science of heat transfer, even though this understanding is relatively modern. Until the 19th century, heat was not well understood in scientific terms. Yet people empirically learned what worked through long experience and incremental improvements. Heat moves in three fundamentally different ways, and every heating method we've discussed relies on one or more of these mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is heat moving through materials, from molecule to molecule. When you touch something hot, you feel it immediately because heat conducts from the object through your skin. Different materials conduct heat at very different rates. Metals conduct heat quickly. This is why a metal spoon left in a hot cup becomes hot along its entire length. Why metal feels cold to the touch, even at room temperature. It's conducting heat away from your hand efficiently. Why cast iron cooking implements work so well. Other materials conduct heat poorly, which makes them good insulators. Air, for instance, is a poor conductor, which is why trapped air is so effective for insulation. Wool, feathers, fur. These all work by trapping air in their structure. The fibers themselves have some insulating value, but it's primarily the pockets of still air they create that provides the warmth. This is why wet wool loses most of its insulating value. The water displaces the air. Wood is a poor conductor, which is why wooden handles on cooking implements stay cool even when the metal portion is hot. Stone and brick conduct heat moderately. They heat up gradually but also retain heat well, which is why they work well for structures like Russian stoves and hypercaust pillars. Convection is heat moving through fluids, liquids or gases, through bulk motion of the fluid itself. Hot air rises because it becomes less dense when heated. Cold air sinks because it's more dense. This creates circulation patterns, convection currents. Every open fire creates convection. Hot air rises from the fire. Cooler air is drawn in from the sides and bottom to replace it. This is what creates a draft in a chimney. The hot air rising up the chimney pulls more air from the fire and pulls fresh air into the room to feed the fire. The taller the chimney, the stronger this effect. Convection is why heat distributes unevenly in a room with a fireplace. The warm air rises to the ceiling, while cold air settles near the floor. If you're standing in such a room, your head might be warm while your feet are cold. This is also why high ceilings were useful in medieval halls. They kept the smoke up high where it bothered people less. But they also meant much of the heat was wasted up where people couldn't benefit from it. Understanding convection helps explain why things like ondel floors and Russian stoves work so well. They heat a large surface that then warms the air in contact with it, and this warm air rises, creating gentle circulation that distributes heat throughout the space without the stratification you get from a point source like a fire. Radiation is heat moving as electromagnetic waves, the same fundamental phenomenon as light, just at wavelengths we feel as heat rather than see as light. The sun warms the earth through radiation, traveling through the vacuum of space where conduction and convection are impossible. A fire radiates heat. You can feel its warmth without touching it, even before the air between you and the fire has warmed significantly. Different surfaces radiate heat differently. Rough, dark surfaces are better radiators than smooth, shiny ones. This is why radiators are often painted dark colors and have ridged or finned surfaces, to maximize the radiation. It's also why Count Rumford's fireplace improvements worked. By angling the sides and back, he increased the amount of heat radiated into the room. Your body radiates heat constantly. even when you feel cold. This is one way you lose heat to your environment. This is why insulation works. It doesn't add heat to your body, but it slows the rate at which you lose heat through radiation and through conduction to the air around you. Every historical heating method relied on these three mechanisms in different combinations. An open fire radiated heat directly to people and objects around it. It heated air by convection, causing that air to rise. It conducted heat into any objects placed in it or near it. A hypocaust relied primarily on conduction through the floor and walls, with some convection of hot air through the system. A Russian stove relied on conduction to heat its mass, then radiation from that warm mass to heat the surrounding space, with some convection of the warmed air. Understanding these principles helps us appreciate how clever some historical solutions were, even though their creators didn't think in terms of conduction, convection, and radiation. They knew empirically what worked, even if they couldn't explain it in modern scientific terms. One factor that significantly affects how warm we feel, though it's less obvious than temperature itself, is humidity, the amount of water vapor in the air. This relates to how our bodies regulate temperature through evaporation. Humans are warm-blooded. We maintain a constant internal temperature, regardless of the external temperature. When we're too warm, we sweat, and the evaporation of that sweat cools us. When we're cold, we try to minimize heat loss, but we still lose some heat through evaporation from our skin and lungs, even without visible sweating. The rate of evaporation depends on humidity. In dry air, evaporation happens quickly, which is why dry cold feels colder than humid cold at the same temperature. Your body is losing heat more quickly through evaporative cooling. This is also why extremely hot but humid conditions feel so oppressive. Your body can't cool itself efficiently through sweating because the air is already saturated with moisture. Many historical heating methods inadvertently dried the air. An open fire or stove burning continuously consumes moisture from the air. The hot surfaces evaporate any moisture that contacts them. Particularly in winter, when cold outside air infiltrates the house and is then heated, the relative humidity drops dramatically because cold air holds less moisture, and heating it without adding moisture makes it very dry. People living in such conditions often experience discomfort from dry air. Dry skin, chapped lips, irritated throats and noses, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. They sometimes address this without necessarily understanding the mechanism. A kettle kept simmering on a stove added moisture to the air through the steam. Pans of water placed near fires served the same purpose. Drying laundry indoors, while partly a practical necessity when outdoor drying wasn't possible, also added humidity. Houseplants, which transpire moisture through their leaves, helped slightly. In very dry climates, or in tightly sealed buildings with high levels of heating, maintaining adequate humidity remains important for comfort and health even today. Historical populations living in drafty buildings might not have had as much of an issue with dry air simply because the infiltrating outdoor air brought moisture with it. But in heated spaces with enclosed stoves or efficient chimneys, dry air could be a real problem. Our bodies are continuously generating heat through metabolism, the chemical processes that convert food into energy. At rest, an average adult generates about 100 watts of heat, roughly equivalent to a bright light bulb. During exercise or physical work, this increases dramatically which is why you feel warmer when you're active. This internal heat generation is why insulation works. Clothing, blankets, heated floors, these don't add heat to your body. They slow down the rate at which your body loses heat to the environment. As long as you're generating heat through metabolism faster than you're losing it to the environment, you maintain your body temperature and feel comfortable. This is also why adequate food was crucial for survival in cold climates before modern heating. Metabolism requires fuel, and that fuel is food. Starving people feel cold partly because their metabolism slows to conserve energy, and they generate less body heat. The connection between poverty, malnutrition, and inability to stay warm was very real in historical populations. The type of food consumed affects how much heat is generated. Digesting food produces heat. This is called dietary thermogenesis, or the thermic effect of food. Protein produces the most thermic effect, followed by carbohydrates, with fats producing the least. This is one reason why traditional winter diets in cold climates often emphasized hearty protein-rich foods, meat, beans, eggs, along with substantial portions overall. A heavy meal made you feel warmer, not just psychologically, but through the actual heat generated by digestion. Hot food and drink provide both direct warmth and psychological comfort. A cup of hot tea or coffee, a bowl of hot soup. These physically warm your core as you consume them, raising your internal temperature slightly. They also warm your hands as you hold them, and they provide a sense of comfort that goes beyond mere temperature. The ritual of preparing and consuming hot beverages was and remains an important part of managing comfort in cold weather. Finally, we should acknowledge that warmth is not purely physical. There's a strong psychological and cultural component to how we experience and think about warmth. Warmth is associated with the safety, comfort, home, and belonging. The English word hearth has always meant more than just a fireplace. It represents home itself, the center of family life. To be driven from the hearth was to be cast out of family and society. The hearth fire was sacred in many cultures, symbolically important beyond its practical function. Visual cues affect how warm we feel. The sight of a fire, the flicker of flames, the glow of coals, these make us feel warmer even before the heat reaches us. War colors in decor, reds, oranges, yellows, create a psychological sense of warmth. Cold colors, blues, greens, create a sense of coolness. This is why Victorian parlors, designed to be cozy, often used warm color palette, while modern minimalist spaces with their whites and greys can feel cold, even when the temperature is the same. Sound plays a role too. The crackle of a fire, the gentle whoosh of a breeze blocked by curtains or walls, even the silence of snow falling outside. These auditory cues shape our experience of warmth and cold. The absence of wind, the muffling quality of heavy draperies and carpets, the quiet of a well-sealed room. These contribute to a sense of snugness and warmth. Texture matters as well. Soft, plush textiles, velvet, wool, fur, feel warm to the touch and create a sense of coziness. Smooth, hard surfaces, metal, glass, stone, feel cold even at the same temperature. This is partly physical. These materials conduct heat differently from your hand. But it's also psychological association. We learn to associate certain textures with warmth or coldness. Cultural practices and expectations shape how we experience temperature too. What feels uncomfortably cold to someone accustomed to modern central heating might feel normal to someone from an earlier era or a different culture. The Victorians sleeping with windows open in winter, or traditional Japanese accepting cold rooms as normal. These represent different cultural standards of comfort. Shared warmth creates social bonds. Gathering around a fire, sitting together under a kotatsu, sharing a bed for warmth, these create intimacy and connection. In many traditional societies, the allocation of warm sleeping spots, positions near the fire, or access to heated spaces reflected and reinforced social hierarchies and relationships. The loss of these shared warmth experiences as central heating has made individual comfort possible might have social implications we barely recognize. When each person can be warm in their own room, there's less necessity to gather together. The hearth as a gathering point has largely disappeared from modern life, and with it, perhaps some of the casual daily interaction that proximity to shared warmth once created. As we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we begin to see heating systems that would be recognizable today. The technology that would ultimately make individual room fires obsolete was developing. Centralized heating using steam or hot water distributed through a building via pipes and radiators. Steam heating systems began to appear in larger buildings, factories, apartment buildings, institutions, and in the mid to late 19th century. The principle was straightforward. Burn fuel, usually coal, in a large central boiler in the basement. Heat water in the boiler until it turned to steam. The steam, being under pressure, would rise through pipes to radiators located in rooms throughout the building. In the radiators, the steam would give up its heat, warming the metal radiators and the air around them. The steam would condense back into water, which would flow back down to the boiler through return pipes, where it would be heated again. The advantages of such a system were numerous. One large boiler could heat an entire building. There was no need to carry fuel to individual rooms. No need to tend multiple fires. No need to dispose of ashes from numerous locations. Temperature could be controlled centrally. The system was relatively clean. All the combustion and smoke happened in the boiler room, not in the living spaces. Early steam radiators were often quite beautiful. Examples of functional cast iron work that was also decorative. They were tall and ornate, with decorative casting that might include geometric patterns, floral motifs, or classical designs. They stood on feet, usually positioned under windows, where the rising warm air would counter the cold air descending from the glass. These early radiators were massive, sometimes 6 feet tall, with dozens of sections bolted together. The more sections, the more surface area for heat radiation. And thus, the more heat the radiator could put out. The radiators were often painted in metallic finishes, silver, bronze, or gold, or in decorative colors to match the room's decor. Hot water systems worked similarly, but used water heated to just below boiling rather than steam. Hot water systems could be simpler. They didn't require the same careful attention to pressure and condensation that steam systems did. The hot water would circulate naturally through convection, rising when hot and sinking when cool, creating a continuous loop without need for pumps. These systems did have their quirks and challenges. The pipes and radiators could be noisy. Steam systems in particular were notorious for clanking and hissing as steam rushed through the pipes and condensate flowed back down. the noise of a steam radiator coming to life on a cold morning, the metallic ticking and knocking as the metal expanded with heat, became a familiar sound in buildings heated this way. Temperature control was imprecise. The boiler was either on or off, burning or not. You could control the heat reaching individual radiators by opening or closing valves, but this was manual. If a room was too warm, you opened a window, a wasteful but common practice. Thermostatic control existed by the early 20th century, but early thermostats were mechanical devices that weren't particularly accurate or responsive. The boiler itself required attention. In coal-fired systems, someone had to feed the boiler, remove ashes, maintain proper water levels, and keep the fire burning at the right intensity. In apartment buildings, this was the superintendent's job. In single-family homes, wealthy enough to have central heating, it might be the homeowner's task, or might be done by a servant. Still, even with these limitations, central heating represented a dramatic improvement. For the first time, it was possible to heat an entire building uniformly, to move from room to room without encountering dramatic temperature changes, to wake up in a warm house rather than having to light fires before warmth was available. The development of automatic temperature control, the thermostat, was crucial to making central heating truly convenient. Early thermostats were mechanical marvels, using the principle that materials expand when heated and contract when cooled. A typical early thermostat contained a bimetallic strip, two different metals bonded together. Because the two metals expanded at different rates when heated, the strip would bend as temperature changed. This bending could be used to open or close an electrical switch. When the room cooled below the desired temperature, the strip would bend one way, closing the switch, which would signal the boiler to fire. When the room warmed to the set temperature, the strip would bend the other way, opening the switch and shutting off the boiler. This automatic regulation meant you could set a temperature and the system would maintain it without constant attention. This seems simple, but it represented a profound change in how people related to warmth. For all of human history, staying warm had required active, ongoing effort. You had to build fires, tend them, manage them. Warmth was something you created and maintained through labor. Now, suddenly, warmth became something you could simply set and forget. Adjust the dial on the thermostat, and the house would maintain that temperature automatically. You could wake up in a warm house, come home to a warm house, without having to think about the fire at all. The labor of heating hadn't disappeared. It had just become invisible. Somewhere, a boiler was firing, burning fuel, creating heat. But this happened automatically, out of sight, and required minimal attention. The coal or later oil had to be delivered and fed to the system, but this was far less labor than maintaining multiple fires throughout a house. Through the early and mid-20th century, oil and then natural gas gradually replaced coal for home heating in most developed countries. Oil burners, which became common in the 1920s through 1950s, automated much of the heating process even further. Oil could be delivered by truck and stored in a tank in the basement or buried outside. The oil was then pumped to a burner as needed. The burner would spray the oil as a fine mist and ignite it, creating an intense hot flame that heated the boiler efficiently. The burner could be turned on and off automatically by a thermostat, and it required minimal maintenance compared to a coal fire. Natural gas was even better. It required no storage, no deliveries. It simply arrived continuously through underground pipes, always available. Gas burners were clean, efficient, reliable. The combustion was controlled precisely, producing no ash, requiring no cleaning. The only byproduct was exhaust gases that vented outside through a flue. With oil and especially gas, the whole question of heating fuel largely disappeared from daily life. You didn't see the fuel, didn't handle it, didn't think about it except when you received a bill. The furnace in the basement or closet operated automatically, turning on and off as needed, maintaining the temperature you set. This represented the final separation between warmth and fire, between heat and visible flame. For thousands of years, warmth had meant fire, had meant flame and smoke and ash. Now warmth came invisibly, soundlessly, with no visual reminder of its source. You felt the warm air flowing from vents or radiators, but you didn't see how it was created. Electric heating emerged as another option in the 20th century. Early electric heaters were simple, essentially just a resistor that glowed when current passed through it, like the visible element in a toaster. These space heaters were portable and convenient but expensive to operate. Electric baseboard heaters, which became more common from mid-century onward, were more sophisticated. These were long low units installed along baseboards, using electricity to heat oil or ceramic elements, which then radiated heat. They were clean, quiet, and required no maintenance beyond occasional dusting, but they were costly to run in areas where electricity was expensive. Heat pumps, a more efficient form of electric heating that became practical in the late 20th century, work by extracting heat from outside air. Even cold air contains some heat and concentrating it inside. They are essentially air conditioners run in reverse. In moderate climates, they can be quite efficient. Though in very cold temperatures, their efficiency drops and they may require supplemental heating. The great promise of electric heating was convenience and cleanliness. No fuel deliveries, no combustion, no flue required. You could have heat anywhere you had electricity. For new construction in areas with cheap electricity, electric heating was attractive. But in many markets, gas remained cheaper, and the infrastructure for gas heating was already established. By the late 20th century, for most people in developed countries, the problem of staying warm had been thoroughly solved. Central heating controlled by thermostats was standard. Homes were insulated far better than historical structures had been. Windows were double-paned, sealing much more effectively. Construction standards emphasized energy efficiency. The result is that most people in wealthy countries now live in a narrow temperature band year-round. Indoor temperatures stay in the range of 68-72 degrees Fahrenheit, 20-22 Celsius, regardless of the season. The temperature variation, that was a fundamental part of human experience for thousands of years, has been eliminated for much of humanity. This is genuinely remarkable. A person living in a modern heated home experiences less temperature variation in their entire life than their ancestors might have experienced in a single winter day. The seasonal rhythm that once shaped life so fundamentally, the preparations for winter, the endurance of cold, the relief of spring, has been smoothed out. We've also lost the skills and knowledge that went with managing warmth. Most people today would struggle to build and maintain a proper fire. We don't know how to bank a fire for the night, how to judge coal quality, how to use a warming pan, how to arrange furniture to maximize benefit from a hearth. These skills, accumulated over generations, have become unnecessary and thus forgotten. The labor of heating has disappeared from view. We don't see the power plant burning coal or natural gas to generate electricity. Don't see the refineries processing oil or the pipelines delivering natural gas. The furnace operates in a closet or basement, largely ignored except when it fails. Heating has become like so much of modern infrastructure, invisible until something goes wrong. As we reach the end of our long journey through the history of staying warm, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the profound changes that have occurred and what they mean for how we live now. The achievement of modern heating is genuinely extraordinary. We've solved a problem that vexed humanity for its entire existence. The ability to maintain consistent, comfortable temperatures with minimal effort and thought is a luxury that would have seemed magical to people living just a century or two ago. Consider what this means for daily life. We wake up in warm homes regardless of the outdoor temperature. We work in climate-controlled offices. We travel in heated vehicles. Extreme cold is an inconvenience rather than a threat. Deaths from cold exposure, once common, are now rare and usually involve unusual circumstances. This comfort has practical benefits beyond mere pleasure. Reliable heating improves health. Respiratory infections are less common. Chronic conditions exacerbated by cold are more manageable. It improves productivity. People can work comfortably in winter. Don't waste energy on simply staying warm. It allows for housing in cold climates that would otherwise be barely habitable. It has all-enabled architectural freedom. Before modern heating, buildings had to be designed with warmth in mind. Small rooms clustered around heat sources, thick walls for insulation, limited window area. Now, buildings can be spacious and open with large windows, high ceilings, and layouts that prioritize aesthetics and function rather than thermal efficiency. The mental space freed up by not having to manage warmth is significant too. Our ancestors spent considerable time and attention on staying warm, gathering fuel, tending fires, arranging living spaces around heat sources, preparing for winter. Now, we simply adjust a thermostat and think no more about it, leaving our minds free for other concerns. Yet something has been lost in this transition, even as we've gained comfort. The seasonal rhythm of life has been largely eliminated for those with access to modern heating. The stark difference between summer and winter, between indoor and outdoor, has been smoothed away. We live in an eternal moderate climate of our own creation. The rituals and practices associated with fire and warmth have largely disappeared. The first are of autumn, the last far of spring, the banking of the overnight finted, the gathering around the hearth. These created markers in time and occasions for family interaction. The loss of these rituals is perhaps small, but it's part of a broader diminishing of seasonal awareness and nature connectedness. The practical knowledge of managing warmth, accumulated over thousands of years, has become unnecessary for most people. We've gained comfort, but lost resilience. If the power failed, if the gas stopped flowing, most of us would be poorly equipped to manage. We might not know how to build a proper fire, how to maximize warmth from limited fuel, how to insulate effectively with available materials. The shared warmth experience has also diminished. When staying warm required gathering around a central heat source, it created natural occasions for family interaction, for conversation, for simply being together. The fire was a gathering point, a focus. Now, with central heating making all spaces equally comfortable, there's less necessity to gather. Family members can be comfortable in separate rooms, reducing casual interaction. The connection between warmth and effort has been severed. Warmth once required work. Gathering fuel, tending fires, carrying coal, cleaning ashes. This made warmth feel earned, made comfort appreciated. Now warmth is simply there, provided automatically, and perhaps taken for granted more as a result. There's also something lost in the absence of fire itself. Humans evolved with fire, lived with fire for hundreds of thousands of years. The sight of flames, the crackle of burning wood, the play of light and shadow, the smell of smoke. These connected us to something primal. Modern heating is clean and convenient, but abstract and invisible. We're warmed by heat we don't see produced by a process we don't observe. There's also a more serious consideration: the sustainability and cost of our comfort. Modern heating, for all its convenience, requires vast amounts of energy. In most of the world, this energy comes from burning fossil fuels: coal, oil, natural gas, either directly in home furnaces or indirectly through electricity generation. This creates greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change. The irony is that in creating perfect indoor climates for ourselves, we're altering the outdoor climate for everyone. The warmth we enjoy comes at a cost that's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. There's also the direct cost: financial expenditure on heating fuel or electricity that can be substantial, particularly for those with limited means. Energy poverty is real even in wealthy countries. There are people who must choose between heating adequately and other necessities, who keep thermostats uncomfortably low to afford the bills, who endure cold because heating costs are beyond their means. This raises questions about how we might heat more sustainably in the future. Can we maintain the comfort we've achieved while reducing energy consumption and environmental impact? The answer seems to be yes. Through better insulation, more efficient heating systems, alternative energy sources like heat pumps powered by renewable electricity, passive solar design, and perhaps accepting slightly less perfect temperature control. Some people are intentionally reconnecting with older heating methods, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Installing wood stoves or masonry heaters, using them as primary or supplemental heat sources. This can be more sustainable if done with modern efficiency standards and responsible forestry. It also reconnects people with the experience of managing fire, of warmth that requires attention. Interestingly, even as modern heating has made fireplaces unnecessary, many people still want them. New homes are built with fireplaces that are rarely used, or with gas fireplaces that simulate the appearance of fire without the bother. This suggests something important about the human relationship with fire. The appeal isn't purely practical. A gas fireplace provides minimal heat compared to the home's central heating system. It's decorative, atmospheric, psychological. We want to see flames, even artificial ones. We want that focal point in the room, that suggestion of hearth and gathering. This desire persists, despite the inconvenience. Wood-burning fireplaces require work. Acquiring wood, bringing it in, building fires, cleaning ashes, maintaining the chimney. Yet people who have them often use them regularly despite having perfectly adequate central heating. The experience of a real fire provides something that adjusting a thermostat doesn't. Perhaps this is about more than nostalgia. Perhaps humans genuinely need, or at least deeply want, some connection to fire, to visible warmth, to the ancient experience of gathering around flame. The persistence of this desire, even when practically unnecessary, suggests it fulfills something psychological, emotional, perhaps even spiritual. As we look forward, perhaps the ideal is not to return to the discomforts of the past, but to find ways to maintain modern convenience while recovering some of what was lost. Being mindful of warmth rather than taking it for granted. Understanding where our heat comes from and what it costs, environmentally and economically. Perhaps adjusting our expectations slightly. Accepting that 68 degrees is comfortable. That we don't need 72. That varying temperature somewhat with the seasons is natural. Wearing a sweater indoors in winter, rather than heating heavily. Using zone heating, warming the spaces we actually occupy, rather than heating everything uniformly. Perhaps occasionally choosing to use a fireplace or wood stove. Not as primary heat, but as an occasional experience that connects us to something older. Gathering around the fire sometimes, marking the seasons, maintaining some small connection to the ancient human experience of making warmth, and appreciating what we have. The warmth that surrounds us now, that we barely notice, that seems simply normal. Our ancestors would have seen it as miraculous. The ability to be comfortable in winter, to move freely through our homes without encountering cold, to wake in warmth rather than having to create it. These are genuine marvels of technology and civilization. The story of staying warm is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, about the gradual accumulation of knowledge and technique over thousands of years. From cave fires, to hypercausts, to chimneys, to central heating, each generation built on what came before, making life incrementally more comfortable. It's also a story about human society, about who had warmth and who provided it, about how warmth and status intertwined, about the invisible labor that made comfort possible for some. The housemaids carrying coal, the furnace slaves tending fires, the woodcutters and coal miners providing fuel. Their work was essential to the warmth others enjoyed. And it's a story about adaptation, about how humans in different places and times develop different solutions suited to their particular circumstances. The Russian stove, the Korean ondol, the Japanese kotatsu, the Inuit igloo. Each represents a thoughtful response to the challenge of cold. A solution that worked with available materials and cultural practices. As you settle in tonight, perhaps with a blanket pulled up around you, perhaps with the gentle hum of a furnace in the background, or the warmth of a radiator nearby. Take a moment to think about this long history. The warmth you feel connects you to a story spanning thousands of years, to countless people who struggled with cold, who found ways to create comfort, who passed their knowledge down through generations. The next time you adjust a thermostat or add wood to a fire, you're participating in a tradition as old as humanity itself. The ongoing quest for warmth, for comfort, for that basic human need to feel safe and cozy when the world outside is cold. May your night be warm, your rest peaceful, and your sleep undisturbed by the cold that once threatened human comfort. Sleep well, knowing that the warmth surrounding you represents thousands of years of human effort, ingenuity, and care. Good night.